Hello and welcome to today's training, Transdiagnostic, Understanding and Treatments for Youth, Conquering Negative Thinking and Behavior, Part 1, with Dr. Mary Elvert, PhD, and Dr. Kenneth Tobin, MD. I am Helen Heyman, Director of Programs at ADAA. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. We will first kindly ask you to mute yourself so that we don't hear any background noise. To mute yourself, you will need to press the gray tab just below the red arrow. Kindly also switch off your webcam. The webcam tab is just below the mute tab. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat panel of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. You will also be able to access materials. If you registered and paid for continuing education credit, you will first need to provide the 4-letter CE code on the webinar evaluation form. The link to the evaluation form in SurveyMonkey will be sent to you 48 hours after the end of the professional webinar. You can either answer the post-test assessment questions at the end of this webinar by staying online. The questions will appear at the very end. At the end of the talk, a screen will come up with the questions. You will have 5 minutes to answer them. You can answer them and click Submit. I would like to now introduce our experts. Dr. Mary Elvert, PhD, is a psychologist with more than 35 years of clinical experience and is director of Elvert, Baker & Associates. She specializes in treating children, adolescents, and adults using cognitive behavior therapies. A central focus is building resilience in children and teens with depression, anxiety disorders, ADHD, and other emotional and behavioral regulation problems. Dr. Elvert is Adjunct Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. Fellow of both the American Psychological Association and of the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, she is also a clinical fellow of the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Dr. Elvert is co-author of Conquer Negative Thinking for Teens, Resilience Builder Program, and audio recordings, Relaxation and Self-Regulation Techniques for Children and Teens, and Relaxation and Wellness Techniques for Adults. And Dr. Kenneth Tobin, MD, is a clinical professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at the George Washington University School of Medicine and is the chief of clinical child and adolescent psychiatry in the emotional and development branch in the intramural research program at NIMH. Dr. Tobin has been with NIMH for 17 years. Dr. Tobin has extensive and diverse experience in child and adolescent psychiatry. He has authored on the diagnosis and treatment of a variety of psychiatric disorders of children, and his work at NIMH now focuses on pediatric mood and anxiety disorders. He is a past member of the editorial board member of the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. He has also worked in an advisory capacity to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Tobin is a diplomat of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology in both general psychiatry and in child and adolescent psychiatry. It is a true honor and pleasure to work with these two professionals. I will now pass the screen along to them.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kenneth Tobin, And I'm delighted to be here with Mary Alvord, and thank you, Ms. Heyman, for making all of this possible and introducing us so ably and really helping us with all the logistics. So just to be underway, let's see where we are.
Okay. Oops.
There we are. So welcome to the presentation on Transdiagnostic Understanding and Treatments for Youth, Conquering Negative Thinking and Behavior. So I'm going to begin in the first part here, and then I'll pass the baton to Mary, who will carry it forward, and then there'll be some time for questions at the end. I'll just say that this is part one of our presentation, and everyone is invited back on January the 18th to hear part two. I have no disclosures. In fact, I am here because I work for the federal government, and so I have no conflicts of interest to report to you. Your objectives today are now displayed, and what we're going to do is talk about negative habitual thinking in developmentally appropriate ways with adolescents. Mary will demonstrate some strategies that assist youth in developing healthier alternative thoughts and actions using a CBT approach. And she'll describe and we'll talk about impairments in reward circuitry and become aware of techniques for cognitive restructuring that are drawn from that. Yeah, so you'll see the first part, and some of this will come in the second part. So I would like to begin with some definitions, and then we'll talk about why we think depression in adolescence is so important. And we'll talk about the relationship between anxiety and depression and what the implications are of this relationship for treatment. And then I'll pass things along to Mary. So when I talk about anxiety here, I'm really talking about these four conditions, the most common conditions of anxiety in children and adolescents. Generalized anxiety, which is really a focus on competence and performance. Separation anxiety, which has to do with concerns about one's safety and the safety of those to whom one is mostly attached. Social anxiety, with concerns about embarrassment. And panic disorder, with or without agoraphobia, refers to sudden episodes of extreme anxiety with fear of harm coming to someone. When we talk about depression, it's a term that's come into common parlance, and sometimes, especially adolescents and young adults, will use this term to describe being very sad. But when clinicians use the word depression, they're really talking about a pattern of symptoms that involve mood, thinking, and one's body. And so when we think about the mood changes of depression, we're talking about sadness or irritability. But I also want to underscore how important changes in thinking and changes in one's body are to this concept of depression. When we think about changes in thinking, anhedonia, or the loss of pleasure in activities, is central. And along with that, people will often complain of problems in concentration, so that their grades, for example, may be declining. They think of themselves as worthless. They think about their situation as being hopeless or being bound to fail. They can be indecisive. They have suicidal ideation, and they have thoughts of death. And in their body, we also see changes in which they're slowed in their movements, or they may be quite agitated. They have fatigue. They sleep either too much or too little. It can be difficult to get off to sleep. They lose their appetites, and they feel a lack of energy or any sort of stamina. So with that as sort of the background for the terms that we're going to be talking about, one of the things that we understand about depression, why it's so important, is that it's potentially fatal. In fact, adolescents with major depression are up to 30 times more likely to die of suicide than adolescents who don't have depression. We also know that there's a developmental piece to this disorder. It has its origins early in life. That is, it begins in childhood or adolescence, And in its severe form, it affects about 9% of adolescents. So that's a good number, a healthy fraction of the population. We also know that in a worldwide way, it's a major public health concern. From the World Health Organization statistics, we know that it's the second leading cause of years lived in disability, and that includes that list of disorders of years lived in disability includes things like heart disease and cancer and stroke. Major depression is the second leading cause of years lived in disability across the globe. So how common is this severe malady? Well, we know that if you just go into any ordinary venue and talk to adults who are there, if you went to your local grocery store and just asked people, about 10 to 17% of adults will have had an episode of major depression within the last year. And while it's relatively uncommon in prepubertal children, maybe 1 to 2%, when it arises in that age group, it's quite impairing. And so one is very concerned about its appearance in the 6 to 12-year-old population. But what we also see is that with the onset of puberty and through mid-adolescence, the rates rise fairly dramatically. And what's important in understanding this work is how looking at what's in the community, doing epidemiological studies, is really important for understanding the rates and the severity of this condition, not just those that show up in clinicians' offices. So this is a very interesting graph from work done in Europe. Dr. Bisto was with our group for a period of time, and what this looks at is the cumulative incidence of major depressive disorder in a general population, a community population, not people showing up because of health concerns or any clinical problem. And what you can see is that about 28% of 34-year-olds will have an episode of, will have had a lifetime occurrence of an episode of major depression. And here what you see is that by age 18, about 13% of adolescents will have had an episode of major depression, which means in your typical classroom of 30, that's going to be about 4 children. And means that this is really a very prominent condition. What we understand about the etiology of this is that there's a combination of genes and environment. We're long past the time where we thought about either or, but we know that it's both. We understand that the genetic contribution to the occurrence of depression is about 30 to 50%. So the variance can be explained 30 to 50% by genetics. We also know that there are 2 different ways in which the environment interacts. One is called a gene-environment correlation, and that means that there are genetic features that lead individuals to engage in activities that may increase the risk of their developing depression later on. Something like if one is very afraid of harm coming to them, they may be much more withdrawn socially, and that may actually increase the risk for their becoming depressed and being more isolated. Whereas a gene-environment interaction is something in the environment that arises that interacts with the genetic vulnerability to bring about depression. So, for example, if one was faced with a very traumatic event that maybe wiped out your community by wildfire, that might trigger an episode of depression in someone who is vulnerable to it.
Just stick the D.
Uh-huh.
Do you want to just, and we just passed the letter D.
Oh, thank you. So the other thing that we're quite interested in is understanding what some of the risk factors are that might anticipate the development of depression in adolescence. And what we understand is there's what's called this homotypic pattern, which essentially says that if you had something as an adolescent, that it's likely to recur as an adult. And so depression in adolescence is likely to recur as depression in adults. And similarly, anxiety in adolescence is likely to recur as an anxiety disorder, perhaps in a different form, but an anxiety disorder in adults. But what many people don't recognize is this heterotypic prediction in which anxiety disorders in adolescence actually increase the risk for depression in adulthood about twofold, and that depression in adolescence actually increases the risk for developing an anxiety disorder in adulthood, again, by about twofold. And so you can see that things jump track here, and what you would expect to be just the same thing arising can actually transform into something different in adulthood. We also know, and from other presentations that you may have heard, that oppositional defiant disorder, particularly the irritable features of oppositional defiant disorder, are a risk factor for depression. Highly irritable, chronically irritable children actually run a 7-fold risk of developing major depression in early adulthood. And then we also recognize that there are these non-specific risk factors that lead the way to anxiety or depression in adulthood. And some of these are, as I said earlier, things like harm avoidance, or having a parent that has comorbid anxiety and depression, and things like punitive treatment in childhood increase the risk for anxiety or depression in adulthood. So the implications of all of this are that impairment in adolescence is actually a major risk factor for impairment in adulthood. And that it's not just a phase. We often hear that people think, oh, well, being depressed in teenagers, that's just a phase. It's actually more concerning, and it's possibly a high risk for developing major depression or significantly impairing anxiety in adulthood. And that leads us to understand that treating anxiety or depression in adolescence can reduce the risk for major depression or impairing anxiety in adulthood. And given the complex causes, treatment can be psychological or biological here. So with that as sort of a background, I'm going to pass things over to Mary's able hands, and she'll continue.
And we're going to switch seats.
Yes.
Thank you all for joining us today. I'm particularly excited about this because I love working with children and teens, and what I see in the practice are not kids with any one disorder. They come in perhaps presenting with anxiety or some sadness or ADHD or trichotillomania or a number of other problems, and what we find is that they may have a little bit of this and a little bit more of that, and that's why I think transdiagnostically and treat them, trying to really discern what is what, but then we move toward what kinds of things and powerful tools do we have that can cut across a number of diagnostic areas. We also sometimes have kids with, some not formally diagnosed ASD, but we would call them the ish kids. And so we have a lot of these kinds of kids with co-occurring diagnostic patterns. So I do have some things to disclose. I have a new book, a workbook that is Conquer Negative Thinking for Teens, that was just released in July. For about 7 years, for about 25 years, we've actually been doing resilience builder groups, and finally wrote up a curriculum, and we do outcome research on that, and in fact we're doing randomized control studies now in the schools. And then I have CDs, which are also audio recordings that can be downloadable. All of these with the goal of really getting the information out there, and I'm passionate. I'm a public education coordinator for the APA, and it's just so critical that we get this out. And as Ken mentioned, the prevalence of adult disorders really begins in childhood and adolescence, and so we want to really nip as much as we can in the bud. So you look here, and when I ask kids what they see, they usually respond with an emotional response. It's scary, or like it's cool. You know, we have more emotional responses, and emotions are not negative or positive. They are, but the corresponding thoughts are something that people don't really think about, including adults. So with every emotion, there is some kind of a covert self-talk or overt self-talk that's going on, but we tend to focus more on the emotional aspect. And so before we begin, because I do so much work also in impoverished schools and I'm in the DC area, which is home to many different cultural and ethnic background. And I think that we just need to take a moment and always think about what cultural considerations should we be aware of, and how is emotion expressed in a particular ethnic group or community, and what kind of stigma is there. If there are various languages, several languages in the home, how are things expressed, in which language? And depending on the ethnic group, we have found various exhibits of somatic symptoms. And I know with trauma-focused CBT, there's a lot of talk about that. So you might want to look into that literature as well. But it is critical that we look at the big picture of a person, sort of the whole person, and what are the family values, and what's the community in which they live. So I was trained originally with behavior therapy way back when at Stony Brook, and then incorporated the cognitive behavior really in mid-70s and later. And this is the model that I work with. I work from an evidence-based model, which has actually changed over years. You know, we used to do things a little bit differently, and it evolves, and that's the beauty of it. You know, we look at these 4 parts that are interactional. The thoughts are critical and often overlooked, and a thought is a thought, and a thought isn't always true, and we have to challenge it, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But we need to recognize the importance of at least assessing what's going on there. And then, of course, the emotional response and the affect, taking that in account. And then the other overlooked aspect is the physiological sensations and awareness. And I break up CBT really into the 4 parts, including the behavior and an action plan. So keep this in mind as we talk through this webinar and again the next one, that we're really looking at the bidirectionality and interdirectionality of these parts to make us a whole. And it's the letter R that just showed up on the screen. So what I do with kids, and I do this to demonstrate a lot of things, but we use rubber bands and demonstrate that if you have lots of negativity, you just stretch and you stretch and you stretch. And what do you need to do so that the rubber band doesn't snap or doesn't break? And that is, you come up with strategies and you come up with ways to deal with it. You come up with coping thoughts and actions, and seek support systems to get that. And this is just a great illustration for kids. There's also, you'll see a stretchy bounce ball. They're not so easy to find, but it's a bounce ball that actually stretches, and then you roll it up and you can make it bounce. And so when you work with youth, I find I need a lot of props to help them understand, and also to keep them engaged and interested. So, you know, part of therapy is the fun factor, and making sure, because we do so much hard work in treatment, that we want to make it as much fun and as concrete sometimes, so that it's clearly developmentally appropriate. And so what I want to focus on is really the thinking and transdiagnostically, sorry. You know, for many years, I've seen books on either depression or anxiety or, you know, perfectionism, and they focus on a few of the thought distortions, and that's why I really wanted to put all of this together, because as I said, I don't see kids who just have, you know, one or two, but they go across the gamut, and then when their parents become aware of it, they too then can use the same language in terms of habitual distortions or habitual thinking that they do. So we use a dartboard without the actual sharp kind. We use the magnetic kind to really illustrate that when you think on target, that is a bullseye. And you can think a little bit off target, or you can think way off target and have a thought that completely doesn't make sense. So for example, years ago I had a boy who didn't turn in his library book at school, and he decided that he was going to fail out of school, and he was a good student. And so we talked about, okay, you lose the library book. Is that natural consequence there? You know, getting kicked out of school, and you know, that was way off. And so we used the dartboard as an illustration and trying to get closer and closer to being on target. So here are some of the transdiagnostic common distortions. The first being that I can't have it. We're not going to cover them all today. We'll cover a few, and then we'll do some more in the part 2. The I can't have it is really about being proactive, and my background goes way back with the resilience literature, and the most important protective factor of being resilient is feeling like you have some control over some aspects of your life, not everything, but that you can do, you can try. You can't do it now, but you can do it later. You can come up with strategies. And of course, the mindset movement has taken this and embraced it too. But we talk about being proactive, catastrophizing associated with anxiety, all or nothing thinking associated with perfectionism. It's not one or the other, it's an extreme. Zooming in on the negative is the wording that we've used for what's also known as filtering or selective attention, and that is really getting stuck on what isn't and the negative aspects of your life as opposed to the whole picture or other possibilities. And an example, clear example with kids is they get in the car, you know, what happened? They had a fairly decent day and something, somebody said something to them that they didn't like, and that's what they get stuck on and focus. So trying to shift that. Also the should habit, also often associated with depression, people getting down on themselves, you know, thinking that they should have done something. You also see kids who think inflexibly and get stuck on that. And then the fortune-telling habit of really always trying to think ahead and predict what is going to happen. So we actually have like a little ball that we talk about it as, you know, pretend this is a fortune teller, and, you know, can you really tell these things to challenge? Mind reading, much the same, blaming others, and then the it's not fair habit. I'm going to go into more detail on a few of these. So this is an example actually from the book, but it's a list of all of the thinking habits that I've just named and a checklist so that you can really look at it and you can go over it with them and talk about which ones apply. I do it using a SUD scale, the subjective units of distress, but I use it in a different way, and I just say, you know, on a 0 to 10, how much of the time do you think you do this? Or 1 to 3, depending on the age and the developmental level. But, you know, how much do you do this? A little bit, a lot, or hardly ever is a good simple way. And just going through this list. Cognitive restructuring is, to me, the way to really help people problem solve and challenge their thoughts. And as I said, you know, we do know that thoughts are just thoughts, and there's many techniques to look at that. But when we're trying to challenge the particular thoughts and the distortions, we really need to look at what are the situations, you know, what are some of their automatic thoughts? What are those habits? And I, you know, again, use a list from the habits. What are some that they frequently experience? And then what are the emotions that are associated with that? And then the challenge questions become things like, how, you know, what's the worst case situation that can occur? How likely is it to happen? Can you handle it? I often say to kids, what would you tell a friend in the same situation? Because that helps them put some perspective in. Often we can't put perspective on ourselves, but we can when we are reaching out to somebody else and helping them. And finally, developing coping thoughts, and then looking at, you know, how do you re-rate your feelings or re-rate your thoughts. I have a fairly structured approach that I use, but I think this is for all of you to really think about, how do you want to outline this. I use whiteboards all the time with kids and with teens, and then I have them take pictures of it on their smartphones. If they don't have one, the parents have one, so that we really have working documents, and then it's just kind of cool to write on the whiteboard with different pens. But the goal for cognitive restructuring is just being able to say that, yes, you can challenge those thoughts. There are ways that you can challenge them, and in fact, it is a problem-solving technique, because you can think of all the other possible thoughts that one might have, or that a friend might have to do this. So we then want to look at, you know, what's a realistic outcome if you can think of all these other possibilities. There are awful traumatic events that happen, and so we don't want to negate that ever, but we do want to have perspective on whatever the thoughts are. And here's again just a worksheet that we have, so that you can have teens, and with kids I do this as well on the board, and I just make colorful little squares, and then we fill them in so that it's concrete and visual, and then they can take it apart and move them around. We often will have a body, and then they can just color in the different parts of the body. And that's you know, kind of a standard CBT approach, but it's really helping them understand the interrelationships between all this. So this is an example of what we do with the I can change, I can try, the resilience. This is, we make remote controls for the younger kids. And in fact, today I mentioned we're doing these randomized controlled trials in the schools. I ran a group this morning. And when we were talking about this very topic, the kids came up with, well, you know, but you have to also to recharge your battery. So, and I said, great, and how do you recharge your battery? So you want to teach them how to change the thoughts, how to challenge them. And here's a great example. You make a little, get a file folder, sheets of paper. Each one has different thoughts or different feelings, however, whichever part you want to focus on. And then how can you challenge it and change the channel? But then that leads you to, how do you recharge the battery for the remote? And then it leads you to talking about self-care and getting enough sleep and eating and having friends. So the beauty of all this for me is when we are talking about changing thoughts, we're really talking simultaneously about changing behaviors. And we know that we need to keep practicing, not perfection, because there is no such thing, but doing the best that we can so that it becomes a positive habit. Another of these distortions is, as I mentioned, zooming in on the negative. And we teach it in a number of ways. And again, depending on the age, But even with teens, I will use a magnifying glass, and we'll put down different events that happened during the day and how they thought about each one. And then we'll take the magnifying glass to the ones that they think were like a huge deal. And then we remove the magnifying glass to really illustrate that it is what it is, and how we see it can really make it blow up or not blow up. This whole concept, zooming on the negative and selective attention on the positive, is really critical for depression and irritability, which we see a lot of, with the groups, and for kids who have ADHD, who get in trouble a lot, they can focus on some of those behavioral issues perhaps that take place in school, and instead of looking at the bigger picture. So we also teach it with filling a glass with water and rocks at the bottom. I don't have rocks on this picture, but to illustrate that, yes, truly, maybe things happen that were unhelpful or unpleasant. We pour water in it, and then we put it through a strainer and have a bowl underneath to catch the water. And we say that if you only have the rocks left, then you're really holding on to that negativity. And what we understand transdiagnostically too is that psychological flexibility is at the core for so many psychological disorders and difficulties. And so we want to try to get them thinking as flexibly as possible, because if you're zooming in on the negative of the day, then you're more likely to remember that. And so then you're carrying it forward instead of carrying forward just the okay moments. So we talk a lot about okay moments, and everything isn't great or terrible. It's usually mostly somewhere in the middle. And really have them become aware of like okay moments. Okay, you ate your breakfast and you weren't rushed and you got to school on time. Those are all okay things. They may not be wonderful and they may not be terrible, but they're somewhere along the continuum. So I use props a lot. I even use them with some of the teenagers, but again, I'm careful developmentally to make sure they don't feel like I'm somehow making it too childlike for them. So for the older ones, we do a lot of monitoring of thoughts, challenging the thoughts, and then what are action plans, because that's the key to generalizing behavior. How can you change and have an action plan at school, at home, and everywhere? And so again, it's shifting your focus, not just the positives, the so-so moments that every day. And we do know from positive psychology how much gratitude is important for our general happiness as well. So here's just an example of a whiteboard, and with this was a younger group of, this was actually a group, but if they can't write, I have them draw pictures of it, and you'll see in the middle there's a pie chart of how much of the time was of the day, were things just okay or actually pretty good, and how much was it something that was unpleasant, and how do you then move past the unpleasant and focus more on the helpful and good things that are happening. We also, at the same time, want to teach tolerance of discomfort so that that does not get, blown up. And that's a key part. So I see myself working not just transdiagnostically, but I'm using so many different strategies, and in my head, I'm trying to get them used to discomfort and tolerate uncertainty of what's going to happen, but also key is understand that they can control some of their thoughts and the resulting emotions and the behavior. And here's just an example of what we did on the computer of just, you know, not focusing on perfectionism, not all or nothing. It wasn't all great or a complete failure, but that you actually could see things in many colors. And, you know, many people talk about this in terms of the shades of gray. I actually like the rainbow and lots of different colors so that we can then label the colors for different ways to think something that isn't perfect or all terrible. And we talk about how this takes a toll on your body. So that picture of the body is something I just, you know, got from Google. I have it laminated and I have lots of copies of it, so kids are always really beginning to understand the physical toll that it takes. In fact, you, like me, I'm sure experience many people coming in because of more the physiological. Kids, you know, going to the nurse a lot because of stomach aches. I've got a kid who's got migraines and is constantly being afraid of having migraines, but getting headaches and tension. And for them to understand how you do this, and unloading can help you feel just better physically. And so we do a little activity with books carrying on the stress or the negatives or however you want to do it, and then taking off a book each time we come up with coping thoughts, such as, you know, I can try, I can ask for help, I can go to the teacher and so that I can understand the material better, I could put more time in it, I can put break tasks into smaller parts, whatever they may be, but I can do something so that I can feel better and I can take this load off. So it's a fun activity, and we have, usually we'll use medium size and small books and large books to connote small unhelpful thoughts, medium unhelpful thoughts, and then big unhelpful thoughts. So case example, and here's the letter H. Here is a complicated, and I would say, yes, complicated, but so much of what we see in the practice. I have had the honor of knowing this young man now since he was 3, came in, literally our waiting room was just left in shambles. So there was parenting issues, there was a lot of hyperactivity, he was dysregulated, he was at the point of being kicked out of preschool, but he had a lot of strengths as well, we look at. But by 5th grade, he was in a gifted and talented but learning disabled class because he was also diagnosed with learning disabilities. He had some ASD features. It was never really met the threshold, but he had enough that it interfered significantly with social relationships. And so parents were able to put him in a small private school. He started making friends, and we worked at all of the thoughts and then translating to action plans and behaviors, starting particularly when he was in 5th grade and expressed suicidal ideation. He did end up being hospitalized just, you know, a short term, 1 or 2 days. But we had to look seriously because he could only see all of the aspects of his life that were going wrong instead of looking at the aspects. And that's where the cognitive restructuring came in. He was able to do it, generate lots of alternatives. We also had family meetings so that we could have the whole family generate alternatives to thinking in situations. We worked on family structure. And this is where the transdiagnostic and sort of trans strategies, if you may, come in as well and are critical. I'm putting this in because I just want to mention behavioral activation, and so I'm not going to go through the whole operant conditioning, but behavioral activation is really crucial as well for especially for severe depression, and the research is clear that sometimes it's more powerful than even the medications and other strategies. And the way I explain behavioral activation is that we're going to come up with activities that perhaps you used to find pleasurable and that are no longer, but we're going to start building them into your schedule. And sometimes the behavior comes before the thought changes. And so sometimes you actually have to do something. I don't like to use the term exercise because it has negative connotations, but we talk about movement. How can they move? How can they run around? How can they catch a ball or play frisbee? How can they start doing the opposite of avoidance, which is so much a part of all of these disorders, and instead slowly increase activities and engagement socially. That's in there. And there's just an example of behavioral activation in terms of the cartoon. This is my depressed stance. When you're depressed, it makes a lot of difference how you stand. Worst thing you can do is straighten up and hold your head up high, because then you'll start to feel better. If you're going to get any joy out of being depressed, you've got to stand like this. Well, if it were only so simple, but it is the beginning changes of, because if you're projecting yourself in a more positive way and more engageable way, people will respond, and then you get that reciprocal process. So this is just an activity we do, my shoulders up, back, and down, to explain the mind-body connection. I realize I'm going through a lot of material, but you can look up a little bit more, but behavioral activation is really critical transdiagnostically, I would say, for anxiety as well as everything else. Change that avoidance and the trap to positive coping, recognizing what are the triggers, what are the responses to what's going on, and what is the avoidance pattern. We spend so much time avoiding and procrastinating, and if we can get that to turn around, then we've got a significant part of the battle going forward. Switching a little bit from cognitive restructuring, we also use mindfulness, and I add part of mindfulness incorporating self-control and all of the senses of, and I'll just lead you for just a couple of minutes of something that I do, but we use sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell for our mindfulness activities. We talk about mindfulness rather than mindlessness and just going through the motions of things, paying attention in the moment, non-judgmentally, but also that it is showing we have self-control. So what I do is I offer them either a chocolate kiss or a mint if they don't like chocolate kiss, and we do an exercise and have them look at that chocolate kiss. We talk about that the urge might be to open it up and pop it in their mouths, but that in fact what we're going to do is we're going to do it mindfully and step by step. Look at that chocolate, that imagine that it's underneath, but first we're looking at the wrapper and the texture, and we're feeling it with our hands. We're putting it to our ears. How does it feel when we wiggle our fingers against that aluminum or the cellophane wrapper if it's a mint, and smell it. How does it smell with the wrapper on? So we're getting the different senses in, and then we open it up. And when we open it up, we're looking at the texture of the chocolate. We're looking at that little piece of paper in there, and we're looking at, again, how that silver contrasts with the brown or with the mint. I like to use peppermint so you have different colors. And then we slowly put it in our mouths. And then we let it melt. We talk about, what have they noticed after. We do this in silence. And I really emphasize that mindfulness helps with cognitive flexibility so that we don't get stuck on the past. We're in the present, and we don't worry and fret for the future. And we have also used self-control because we know that self-regulation is key to promoting resilience, and along many gradients, positive work, relationships, school achievement, along many gradients, it's positive to have all this. And this is the letter N. I think we'll talk about this in a moment after questions, but I think we are ready for some questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elvert and Dr. Tobin. Yes, indeed, we're going to now start to answer some of the questions that have been submitted. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions to the chat panel in your attendee control panel. Let us start with the first question that just relates to one of the slides we saw in mindfulness. Dr. Elvert, could you please tell us a little bit more about psychological flexibility as a transdiagnostic tool?
I think that what we see with flexibility, we know traditionally we used to think about rigidity and flexibility with kids with autism spectrum. But I think what we have learned over the years, and it's been written from a number of different theoretical perspectives, that it's the flexibility that helps us cope. It helps us think about life with not just this is what the event is and this is the way I'm going to respond, but rather possibility. So diagnostically, I like to look from a behavioral approach as opposed to like the DSM. I really like to see what are the features that are getting in the way. It's more of a functional behavior analysis, if you will. You know, functionally, what is getting in the way of this teenager who's presenting before me or a child? And the psychological flexibility is a question for the whole family. Like when there are transitions, when there is a new situation, how is this youth dealing with it? How does the family deal with it? Because from my perspective, it's not just the child and teen we're dealing with. We're really treating the whole family in order to generalize all of the skills and also for relapse prevention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elvert. Before we get to the next slide you have up here is a question for Dr. Tobin. Dr. Tobin, in the beginning of your presentation, you were showing how having anxiety and depression as a child could be very much reduced if there were treatments, as this could be otherwise doubled in adulthood, meaning once one became an adult, one would be much more depressed and anxious. Could you please tell us more about different strategies that could be addressed for youth for diminishing this risk?
Well, I think our view here is that treatment, psychological treatments of the kind that Mary has been talking about, evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy, or in some cases interpersonal psychotherapy for depression with adolescents, does seem to offer a reduction in that risk. It also may arm the person with tools that they can begin to apply should their condition recur. And when we meet together next time, we'll talk a little bit more about the risks of recurrence in this condition and how people can be given tools to work with the reemergence of symptoms should that arise. One can also work biologically with medication, and the treatment with medication reducing the episode, its length and severity, may also mitigate against future difficulties with anxiety and depression in adulthood. not perfectly, but we think that mitigating the severity of the illness in adolescence will reduce the severity and difficulties that one encounters as an adult.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tobin. I'm happy to have you both present again, or we can go on with some questions.
Yeah, why don't you go on with some questions?
That's great.
Yes, there was interest from a participant. The list of negative habits, this impressive list of negative habits. Dr. Elvert, with the youth you're working with in your practice, which habit do you come across the most? And why would it be the case? Why would you say that would be the case?
Well, we're known for treatment of anxiety disorders, so I would say that probably the catastrophizing, and I would say that anxiety probably is the most common disorder, and it's actually catastrophizing is the most common thinking error that many of us do. So that, and I think that one is really important because, you know, the thinking errors, they're not discrete categories, because catastrophizing actually also involves some mind reading, right? You're trying to think about, oh my goodness, this might happen, or this person might think something. So that, I would say, is probably the number one as a category. And then for those with social anxiety, we treat a lot of social anxiety, a lot of exposures with kids, you know, doing surveys in our office. The prominent one for that is the mind reading, because they are assuming, and I think we can all relate to this too, you know, we give a presentation and someone looks like they're falling asleep and we think, oh my goodness, you know, we're boring, it's awful, they're gonna walk out, you know, I'm a failure. But take social anxiety and magnify that assumption of judgment. And then I guess the third one that I would say is the focusing on the doom and gloom, and that imbalance of seeing life.
Yeah, I actually might jump in just a little here to say that at least among depressed teens that we see and treat, something that we refer to as a negative attention bias, the way in which one is more attuned to negative events, holds on to negative events, and predicts that things in the future will be negative, are very much a part of depression.
Right. And then for young kids, it's not fair. You know, you hear that, and some of that is normal. And in fact, what we say, all of these thinking habits are normal. It's just how much do you do it? So we all catastrophize sometimes. You know, when my kids started learning to drive and I hear a fire engine, I go, oh no, someone's in an accident. You know, so we do it. It's how much, and can you immediately to shift with, well, that's not a reasonable thing. And so for young kids, I see a lot of the it's not fair. For a lot of more of my oppositional subset, it's the blaming other people. And instead of taking responsibility. So these, again, these categories are not discrete. They really, you can have a few of them, and some of them are not sort of complete distortions. You know, they may be milder and people can shift out. And that's the goal, is like we all experience these, but how can we shift out of them quickly enough so we don't get stuck?
We don't really have a favorite negative habit.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think just the last question before we will end. You had a last slide. Dr. Tobin, would you like to share a bit of information about this study at the National Institutes of Mental Health?
Yes, so I'm actually part of a group that is now focusing its attention on adolescents with depression, from the work that's been done with irritability and also the work that's done with children with anxiety. We recognize that depression in adolescence is important as an outcome of those conditions, but also in its own right, and trying to understand how depression in adolescence is different than depression in adults, and to understand brain function in adolescents with depression. And I'll have a lot more to say about that when we meet in January. But if people were interested in participating in research studies, this number that's in the red rectangle would be one that they could call, or you can reach us through the email address that's at the bottom of that rectangle. And it would allow us to assess children who have depression and also to offer recommendations for treatments that may be effective for them. And that's at the intramural program in Bethesda, Maryland.
I just want to note, because I'm not sure how it happened, but the learning objectives, that third one is actually for part 2. So Dr. Tobin is going to be talking about neural circuitry at that point. So we'll have to adjust the learning objectives so that they're correct. I apologize for that.
Oh, no harm done, and of course, we'll do that.
Much more next time in depth.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Elvert and Dr. Tobin. As a reminder, yes, the second part of this webinar will be on January 18th from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Registration is already open. You will be receiving a follow-up email within 48 hours that includes a link to the evaluation and also a link to the recording. Please do share your thoughts even if you're not requesting CE. If you're not yet an ADA member, please consider becoming one. ADA offers an excellent member benefits package such as year-long access to continuing education, free access to special interest groups, including peer online consultation groups such as on child and adolescent, significant discount to ADA's annual 4-day conference, promotion of your practice in ADA's online Find a Therapist database, and much more. Thank you so much for attending this webinar, and a special thanks to our 2 presenters. We hope you will join us in the second part on January 18th and at the Anxiety and Depression Conference in Washington, D.C. from April 5th to 8th.
Thank you, Ms. Heyman.
Thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.